Hello! For this episode, I've been lucky enough to have a request from a friend, former colleague, and hopefully viewer, who has asked if I could do something about the origin and history of our notation system. I started working on that, and I've found that there's so much interesting stuff to say that I've decided to make it a double. How I'm going to do that is, in this first part, I'll focus on the development of notation for pitch, which is what happened first, and then in the second part, I'll switch gears and focus on notation for rhythm. If there's one thing that I absolutely love, it's getting requests and questions from you. So if you have anything you'd like to know about, please let me know. It will make my life easier and give you the opportunity to watch a video about something you're interested in. All right, without further ado, let's get to it. I'm Peter, and this is Something About Music. Okay, so when I say notation, what I mean is simply something that can be written down to give you information about how to perform a piece of music. In the modern version of the European system I'll be talking about today, there's practically no end to the kinds of information that can be indicated. For example, how loud or soft to be, how quickly to move, how to hit particular notes. But for our purposes, I'm going to stay pretty focused on the two most essential pieces of information, and the two that developed earliest in history. Those are the pitch, which is indicated in our system spatially by literally placing notes higher or lower on the page to show you how high or low they should be. And rhythm, which is indicated graphically by giving different notes different shapes to show how long or short they should be in relation to one another. This is one way for a notation system to work, but it's not the only way. And actually, even in the modern world, we have a few other systems that operate completely differently. Think, for example, of tabulature, which literally tells you what movements to make with your body to play a particular instrument. Or there's something we might not think of as a notation system, but absolutely is, which is the letter names of notes, although they're most often used as stand-ins for the chords that can be built on those notes. There were also other notation systems that came before. The very earliest example of a piece of musical notation that anyone has found so far is this, a hymn to the goddess Nikal that was written down in Babylon in about 1200 BCE. It's written in a dialect of Sumerian, which was an already ancient language that served a pretty similar purpose in ancient Mesopotamian society to the one that Latin has served in Europe since medieval times. It uses a system where cuneiform letters stand in for the strings of a harp tuned in a particular way. The ancient Greeks came up with a couple of different notation systems that operated along similar lines, and we know that at least one of these was in use until about 500 AD, because Boethius, a guy who we can sort of think of as the last of the ancient Roman writers, used them in a book about music that he wrote around that time. About 100 years after that, a Spanish archbishop and philosopher named Isidore of Seville wrote that there was no way to preserve musical melodies in writing. Isidore, who's also credited with inventing the period, the comma, and the colon, was a guy who had a pretty good idea of what was going on in his world, so it seems pretty likely that they had fallen out of use during that time. This brings us to a key point about musical notation that will be relevant going forward, and that's that it's really not that important. You can do a whole lot in music without it, which is why so many music cultures have historically opted to go without it. For example, we know from art and archaeology that music was incredibly important for the ancient Egyptian society, but we've never had any indication of a musical notation system coming from them. With the possible exception of this curious example from the 7th century, which I just want to show you because I think it looks really cool. Even in our modern music culture, where written notation is probably as important as it ever has been, we still have, for example, rock bands who often make incredibly sophisticated and complex music without using it at all. About 100 years after Isidore, some scholars working for the kings of the Franks discovered Boethius's book and really liked it. They sent copies to monasteries all over Europe and basically made it the center of the European music curriculum throughout the medieval era. From this, we know that early medieval Europeans had access to the ancient Greek notation system, and if they'd wanted to, they could have used it to preserve all of their melodies. But, with the exception of this one example from a book called Musica in Kyriadis, which is pretty famous for being the first mention of polyphony from medieval Europe, they didn't, because they didn't need to. These people were living in an active oral music culture, in which music was really thought of as something you do, not really so much as a thing, in the way that we might think of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as an object to be appreciated. As much as we might wish it could have been otherwise, the idea of preserving their music for future generations to enjoy probably just wouldn't really have occurred to them. Something like developing a new notation system isn't really something people just do. It's something that usually happens in response to a particular problem that demands a solution. The issue with that is that, especially when we're talking about a time and place from which the vast majority of sources have been lost, sometimes it's not so easy to pin down just what that problem may have been. This finally brings us to the beginning of our real story, which happens in the context of the early medieval Catholic Church. As you may know, people in the church, particularly monks and nuns, spent a great part of every day singing, and for every day there were special melodies and texts to be sung. Now, as much as it might seem to us that it would have been a huge problem to remember all of these tunes and words, it actually seems like the gradual process of simply learning from the people who already knew them worked pretty well, and for centuries people were able to remember what to sing every day. Still though, from around the 10th century, we start to see little books of these chants where the texts are accompanied by little squiggly lines that show the shape of a melody, but not the specific notes. These squiggles, which are called neumes, don't look all that familiar to us, but they are actually the beginning of the notation tradition that's still with us today. Just where these neumes originally came from is still a bit of a mystery. It's possible that they were based on those little accent symbols that you see over letters in French, which apparently originally stood for alterations in the spoken pitch. It could also be that they came from a system of punctuation that was being used at the time, or from hand signals that were used by choir masters. Or maybe they come from an original source that's now lost from the Eastern Church, where a form of neumes is still being used today. Or maybe they have no original source at all and were just something people came up with. Basically, it's anyone's guess at this point. Maybe an even bigger mystery is just why people started using them. There is a story about this that I was told, but it might have a few issues. Basically, those kings of the Franks that I mentioned earlier, most notably Charlemagne, were very interested in the prestige of Rome, both in terms of its position at the heart of the Catholic Church and its legacy as the old seat of the Roman Empire. They were also very interested in consolidation, and so one thing that they famously did was take a bunch of tunes that had been in use in the Roman Church and pretty much force almost everybody in their empire to start using a version of them. These tunes, and others that were developed to go along with them, are what's referred to as Gregorian Chant. Now, as difficult as it would have been to learn all of these tunes and words in the first place, you can imagine what a burden it would have been to suddenly be asked to learn a whole new set all at once. So the traditional idea is that the neumes were created to ease this transition and help people learn the new tunes more quickly. There's just a couple of problems with that. First of all, the earliest sources of neumes that we have come from more than 100 years after this original transition would have taken place. And the tunes that they set are not even part of the Gregorian repertoire. Also, there's really no indication that these neumes were ever being used to teach students to sing in the first place. The books that we have featuring them are really small and seem pretty clearly to have been intended for use by the cantor or choir master or choir mistress. These were the people whose job it was to be more familiar with the tunes than anyone else. So what on earth were they using these neumes for? All this is made even more difficult by the fact that nobody seems to have been particularly concerned about it at the time. There's absolutely no historical mention of the creation of neumes or even the fact that they were being used. They just kind of appear. At any rate, wherever these neumes came from and whatever they were originally for, they caught on pretty quickly and spread throughout Central and Western Europe. This is worth noting because, from our perspective, they're really pretty inadequate. You can't look at a numated chant and have much of any idea of how to sing it. This is a good reminder of how the demands of people living within an oral music culture are incredibly different from the demands of a historian trying to look backwards and figure out what people were singing in the past. It's likely that neumes contain quite a bit of information about how to sing a piece of music that we've mostly forgotten how to interpret over the years. For a lot of people, this was just more important than what specific pitches to sing, and so they kept using them. Even after most of the other developments we'll be talking about today, neumes stayed in use, and we have examples of them from as late as the 15th century. Not everyone was quite so satisfied, though, because from around the later part of the 10th century, we start to see some chant books where someone has drawn a line in the middle of the neumes, and eventually two lines representing the pitches of C and F. Now, when I say things like C and F, we should keep in mind that pitches were really only conceived of in relation to other pitches within a tune. There's no indication that anyone had much of an idea of a fixed, unchanging frequency called C until maybe as late as the 17th century. With these lines, you still couldn't know exactly what pitch to sing at any given moment, but it gave you a much better frame of reference, and it definitely set the stage for the next step in our story. By around the end of the 10th century, it seems that, at least for some people, the system of unlined neumes was starting to present a problem that demanded a solution. Records from this era are still so spotty that it's pretty difficult to say exactly what that problem may have been, but there is one possibility that's worth mentioning, simply because it will be echoed in our story a little bit later on. One thing about neumes that's definitely worth knowing, because it continues to be true of notation throughout the medieval era, is that it was conceived of syllabically. When one note fell on one syllable, it was written out individually, in a symbol called a virga or a punctum, which basically formed the origin of our modern note shapes. When multiple notes fell on a single syllable, though, in what we call a melisma, they were grouped together in special shapes called ligatures. For us today, these ligatures can be something that make medieval music look quite unfamiliar and even mystifying, but for people at the time, it seems to have been what was by far the preferred way of writing down a piece of music. One reason why we think this has to do with a trend from the time called Troping, which involved taking a chant that didn't really have very many words in it, like a Kyrie or an Alleluia, and basically just packing it full of text. In books featuring these tropes from the late 10th century, it starts to be common to see the same chant written out two different times side by side, once in a plain version with ligatures, and once with all the text included. Not only would this have been really time-consuming and laborious, but it also would have been quite expensive. You might have noticed by now that medieval copyists really liked to make the most out of a sheet of parchment. This may or may not have been the problem that led a humble North Italian singing teacher named Guido of Arezzo to come up with the solution that brings us into the next stage of our story. Towards the beginning of the 11th century, Guido took neumes and placed them on a system of 4 lines, creating, maybe for the first time in history, a system of musical notation that was designed for someone to be able to pick up a piece of music that they had never heard before and simply sing it directly from the page. He also created other technologies, like the earliest version of solfege, to help make this new concept of sight singing more doable. Guido used a system of color coding to indicate which line stood for which particular note, but it didn't take long for someone to come up with the idea of simplifying things by simply writing a little letter, usually C or F, on one of the lines to provide a frame of reference. Over time, these letters became more stylized and ultimately evolved into the C and F clefs that we have today. The G, or treble clef, which is probably the most familiar to most people today, was a relative latecomer and only became common when violins demanded that people start writing down music for much higher registers. But it evolved under pretty similar circumstances. Although the modern version, as you might guess, is probably pretty influenced by the cursive capital S, standing for sol, as in do, re, mi, fa, sol. While we're talking about Guido, it's also worth mentioning that he deserves credit for the symbols we use to make notes flat, natural, and sharp. In the music theory that Guido knew, there was really only one note, B, for which this was applicable. He proposed using a rounded or soft B for the flats and a squared off or hard B for the naturals. Over the next few hundred years, the theory expanded to make room for other altered notes, and so people started to use his symbols as cues for making a note higher or lower. Eventually, it became necessary to make a distinction between natural and sharp notes, and so eventually two different versions of the squared off B were differentiated from one another. The potential usefulness of Guido's system seems to have been pretty immediately apparent to a lot of people, because it starts to pop up all over the place quite quickly. Over the next couple of centuries, the idea of musical notation seems to have really been entering the mainstream, and much more music than at any other point before in history started to be written down, including a lot of music from outside of the church. The written music from this era still looks pretty unfamiliar to us, but in terms of how pitch was communicated, it was basically already our modern system. In fact, a version of this so-called square note or quadratic notation system is still used by the Catholic Church for Gregorian Chant, to the minimal extent that the Church still uses Gregorian Chant after the reforms of the Vatican II Council. There have, of course, been a few changes over the past 1,000 years or so, but it's minimal enough that someone familiar with this system could pretty easily pick up a piece of music from this era and, for the most part, sing it without any trouble. Alright, that'll bring us to the end of this first chapter. In the next part, we'll talk about how rhythm was added into this system over the next 300 years or so, and we'll finally get to some of the note shapes that we would recognize today. For now, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then. So long, and thanks for watching.